we're going to try and have mostly new content. So there was a lot that was covered last month. I had a presentation that was on the same topic of budget development. And so we covered a lot of issues there. And this is sort of a follow-up. So there are going to be some things that are repeated, but mostly we're going to try and do new stuff. But this is just me rooting just what motivates me as a school board director in trying to make things better in Oakland. And for me, it always goes back to the experience I had last fall as part of the Measure H campaign, bringing high school students together with volunteers and advocating for more funding for our district. And what's been so successful with College and Career for All is that there's been a lot of accountability on the money. There's been real planning, real transparency, and it's been hugely successful in raising our graduation rates. And so it restores my faith, at least, that we can actually make positive change in the district towards better fiscal use of our dollars and towards actually creating real change that has positive outcomes for students in an equitable way. And so I just have to start there so I don't get too caught up in the drama myself, but really rooted in what is the positive outcome that we're trying to achieve together. And so one of the positive outcomes we're trying to achieve as a board this year is to invest a significant amount in increasing compensation for all of our employees, our teachers, our classified staff, like everybody, because we see districts, neighboring districts, and all across the state giving significant raises to their employees. And we know that, the cost of living is going up radically in California, and we need to help our employees even to be able to afford to stay in Oakland. We really need to make that move. At the same time, and I know that there's been a lot in the media lately about budget negotiations between OUSD and some of its labor partners, and I don't really feel comfortable talking about that in this space. And so there might be places where it seems like we're not answering certain questions or we're not talking about certain subjects, and that's because it's actually against the law for me as a school board director to engage in bargaining in public. There's a bargaining table, and that's where those discussions happen. And so there's some things which we might not want to talk about tonight, just to be respectful of that process and how it's going. So I just want to acknowledge, right, we met a month ago to address the proposed budget adjustments. And the process got a little messy because the actual proposed adjustments didn't get released until the very afternoon of the day on which we were meeting last time. And so we weren't really able to talk about them in detail. And then we all expected that they were going to get passed the following day, and they didn't. It got delayed by 10 days until March 9th. And so just the whole process was a little messy. And I know one of the questions that came up was, why was it so urgent? And the reason is because school districts are required to notify employees if there are any layoffs. They're required to notify them by March 15th. And so we had to make those decisions in advance of March 15th to even know who was getting noticed and who wasn't. And it ended up being mostly, in terms of the impact of the budget adjustments, it ended up being mostly vacancies that were eliminated and a handful of other positions that were noticed. And then there were a bunch of other positions that where there were layoff notices because of other budget development processes separate from the board action. But all that to say, that was only the first step of budget development. And now there's a whole other series of steps until our final budget is adopted on June 30th, or it's actually in advance of June 30th. I think the actual date is going to be June 28th this year. And so the process isn't over. We still have a lot of steps to go and a lot of engagement that we can have between the district, the community, including Parent Student Advisory Committee, other district committees, in order to really have good discussions around, well, we freed up all this space in our budget by doing these adjustments. And so now what are we going to use those funds for? What are the gaps that we need to fill? And what other steps do we need to take? And then another conversation is, since that process was kind of messy, looking forward to next year, how could it be better next time? And I think one of the things that you saw happen was there was a lot of discussion happening between staff and board directors, and we have a lot of new board directors. None of us have been on the board for longer than 2 years. And so I think we really needed to give more time for community engagement. And this is not a new problem. This is a problem that's happened repeatedly. And so I think we as a board really need to adopt a policy around the timing of this budget adjustment process so that there's more lead time and we're actually doing some of the conversation in January rather than waiting until February. And the last piece about why it was messy was that we're in a difficult, changing economic moment where the state suddenly pulled back on some of the funding that they were going to offer us. It's not clear where it's going to end up. They don't actually have to decide until June. And so it's always, we're always kind of making it up as we're going because we have to create a budget based on what the state is going to give us, but we don't know what they gave us until they give it to us. And so with the current economic climate, we're still trying to figure out how much of a cost of living adjustment is the state actually going to give districts this year in June. And so those are our legislators, Mia Bonta, Buffy Wicks, Nancy Skinner, and Governor Newsom. So they're playing a big role in some of the drama that we're dealing with. Okay, I think I'm out of time, but the last point is also, there's another player in all of this because it's Oakland and we are in fiscal receivership. And so we have a county trustee who has just asked a lot of questions about some of the adjustments that we did and even used the word risky describing some of them because she's just really points us again and again to the principle that we should use one-time resources for one-time expenses and ongoing resources should be used for ongoing expenses. And I'll just go back to that analogy I used last time because I don't want to put too many words into Luz Caceres's mouth, but the analogy I've given in the past is, we're under fiscal receivership. We have the car keys, we're driving the car, but the county trustee is always sitting there in the passenger seat, looking over our shoulder, looking at how we're driving. So until we get out of fiscal receivership, she still plays a big role because she can stay or rescind any action we take. And so if we want to get out of fiscal receivership, we have to show not only take a bunch of steps. One of those steps is really to demonstrate that we're responsible enough to drive the car on our own. And if we crash the car, we're never going to get those car keys. So we need to act responsibly if we want to leave fiscal receivership and really be in control of our own district as in terms of making our own decisions for ourselves. But until that point, she does have the authority to stay or rescind anything. And I've heard a lot of questions from her about some of the actions we're taking. So with that, I will pass it over to, I think this one is all DeCarlos. So I will pass it over to him, stop sharing and let him take the wheel. And DeCarlos is our new CFO. He presented last time if you weren't here, but he's a real asset to the district coming from the county, and he's new in Oakland Unified this year.
Good evening, everyone. Super glad to be here. I was telling Director Davis before we got on that I learned just as much from these sessions being new. I'm starting my 8th month. And so this helps me just as much as it helps everyone else. The questions and the interaction is really good for me. I also really appreciate the picture you got. You still the trustee there. Nice touch. So I'm DeCarlos Kaigler. I'm the Chief Financial Officer, started August 1st. I was formerly with ACOE for the 8 years prior to coming here and served as the Director of Fiscal for a couple of districts in the Central Valley. Mr. Christmas, you all know him well. He's been here for a while. He's going to sort of support in the presentation. But as far as the narration of what you're going to see, I'll be doing all of this. I do want to that. I'm going to go over a couple slides that are real sort of 1,000-foot view for the local control funds that we receive. And then I'm going to switch gears and we're going to talk about like the restricted and the grant funds that we receive. I want to, before I forget, give shout out to Mr. John Mayer, who was the grants manager who put together those last slides. He did a really good job, and I just want to make sure that he receives the credit for the really good work that he did in putting all that together. So 15 minutes, we're rocking and rolling. So what happened? Budget adjustments passed on March 9th. The following is a summary of the adjustments listed in the resolution. The resolution is 23-0545A. If you click on that link, it'll take you to the district's Legistar information landing page, and you can get the details on it. But overview, the budget will shift 13.2 million in positions and expenses to the ESSER pandemic funds. ESSER is the elementary and secondary school relief funds we received as a result of the pandemic. They're one-time in nature, but they stretch over several years, and we'll go a little more in detail on the ESSER funds in some slides to come. 5.8 million in central positions in several departments pending reorganization. We'll touch on that as well. 3.3 million proposed reduction for 24-25 in school site funding. This is for discretionary and unduplicated pupil supplemental funding. We'll cover that. 2.5 million potential savings in fiscal year 24-25 from an unspecified number of school mergers following an equity impact analysis as required by Assembly Bill 1912. We are also projecting a temporary teaching positions of about 1.6 that are all funded centrally for what we consider special situations. Approximately $9 million reduction to central budgets for curriculum adoptions and department discretionary funds. And then many central positions were shifted to supplemental concentration or restricted funds to free up general purpose dollars for other things. And then some of the positions, as Director Davis mentioned, were vacant and the vacancies were eliminated. Some of them have been vacant for multiple years. So the actual impact on the classroom is less as opposed to eliminating a position with an FTE in there. Other areas addressed by the board on March 9th. The board also issued a freeze on new hiring, including TSAs, teachers on special assignments or TOSAs, as well as confidential management positions. A couple of other things that the board and staff will review as it relates to district business is special education staffing, the impact of all TSA positions, central office mid-level management positions. There will also be an equity analysis that is required by AB 1912 and a planning year before any schools are merged, and that wouldn't happen until 24-25. Okay, the next slide that I'm going to cover sort of illustrates the fluidity in California school budgets. And this is one of the things that I think if the community had a better understanding of, it would allot a little more trust, because the way these numbers flip, they can be a little misleading. I'm going to flip back and forth over the next 3 slides just to provide some context. But what you're looking at is our multi-year projections for our local control funding formula revenue over the course of the next 4 years. This information was based on data that we had available to us on February the 8th. So not even 2 months ago, 6 months ago. And so if you look, we're showing 459 million for the existing fiscal year. And then if you look at the out years, we're showing an uptick in revenue based on several assumptions, ADA, UPP, and other factors. Now, from that time to what we reported at first interim, you can see this is only for the current fiscal year. This is what was reported at our second interim financials, that overall, right, we're down $1 million. This considers the same COLA that we proposed in this budget model in 22-23. It's still 8.13. What changed is we had an update in our ADA projections. So you can see slight little change can cause significant impact on your revenue. And then as we go to the next slide, you'll see a little more in detail about how fluid California school budgets are. At first interim, for the budgetary year, which is 23-24, that's the budget projected year, our planning COLA was 5.3. which resulted in projected revenue of $472 million. By the time we got to second interim, we all California public schools typically attend the governor's January budget model. And the planning COLA at that time was 8.13. So everyone went, did their second interim, put our budgets together. And by the time the budgets were basically produced, that COLA had changed by the Legislative Analyst Office, or LAO, who is now projecting 6.4% COLA. The reason why this is significant, if you look at the delta between what is currently known and what is possible, the delta is $7.6 million. That's less than 2% difference that yields $7.6 million. It's actually 1.73, but that's equal to, in Oakland School District, using our average teacher salary, 56.5 full-time teachers or 102.28 full-time pairs by just that little switch in the COLA. Okay, so that was all of our locally controlled funds. Now we're going to take a look at, where to go? Now we're going to take a look at the restricted side of the house. So OUSD is about a 55-45 split. It just depends. But if you notice on the previous slide, we're reporting $458 million of local control funding formula. Our total revenue, it's about a little over 800. So if you put that in context, over half of the revenue received is restricted, or it comes in some form of a block grant. So what is a block grant? I'm going to give you the textbook definition. A block grant is a grant that combines multiple areas of focus into one funding stream. A block grant can be one-time or ongoing. Here at OUSD, we have several block grants. To name a few: mandated costs, transportation, and these are actually two transportation resources combined. We also have TIIG, or you hear it referred to as TIG, Targeted Instructional Improvement Block Grant. And then a couple new grants that will hit the books next year is the Art Music Instructional Block Grant. These are all ongoing resources, although they're block grants. So what grants do we have currently? So if you look at the way John will lay these out, is the top boxes in blue are the state grants. The middle grants are measures. So the measures are the voter approved parcel taxes that typically spanned over several years. And then in the green on the bottom are considered our local or philanthropy grants. So that comes from places like Eat, Learn, Play, the Curry Foundation, and things of that nature. The reason why we listed these in particular, because these are the biggest grants that have the most impact on the budget with the largest number of FTEs. So if there's any questions on that later, we can go back to that. Again, this is meant to more illustrate what we have, not necessarily how it's going to be used yet. That is more of a next step in the process. Right now, we're just allocating the budgets, making sure everything's aligned. The two new block grants that came on this year that are significant are the Arts Music Instructional Block Grant. That's resource 6762. It was originally slated for OUSD to be 19.6 million. It has since been cut. It's projected to get cut as high as 50%, but it could be less. But we're planning conservatively. If it comes in to be a little less, better for the district. The other big one is the Learning Recovery Emergency Fund, and that was a result of the pandemic as well. This is $54 million, and it needs to be spent or committed by June 30th of 28. These are our planning year grants. So the planning year is the projected budgetary year. For us, that's 23-24. And this is more or less what we're planning to have, not necessarily the plan of what we're going to do with it. There's several steps that you have to take on some of these in terms of spending the funds. You have to get approval and buy-in from your localities. A lot of times, some of these need to be approved by the board, and there's other factors that go into them. The key things to notice is that our local grants, you can see we're seeing a small decrease in some of the ongoing grants. As an aggregate, it's about 1.25, but overall, because we've received other grants, we're up about 1.7. And then the last set of boxes are all the new funds that we'll be receiving for next year. The Prop 28 is sort of meant to supplement the loss in the art, music, PE supply grant money, but it's still up for grabs. But if you look at it to the net effect, it's still a slight loss, even if we receive the entire 6 million, because we lost 9.8. And so if we get 6 million in Prop 28, we're still down. This is the 22-23 grants compared to the 23-24 grants, mirroring what we spoke about on the previous slide in terms of the local grants going down a little bit. You can see where they are next year relative to where they are this year. But then also you can see the new grants that came in. We have the literacy coaching grant, resource 11 for 1.6 million a year respectively. And the next slide, you'll see some of the, I'll kind of illustrate how these grants work, because some of them are ongoing and some of them are one-time in nature, although they expand over several years. So this is the summary of the new funding that we received since the spring of 2001, but it also includes updated expiration dates. The reason why this is important is we can spend the funds this way up into the expiration dates, but it is the district's discretion on how they spend. They can spend the entire amount in 1 year or 2 years, but just to give you a lay of the land, we're showing you what it would be respectively if we laid it out equally over the term of the grants, and then when each grant expires respectively. One thing to note about the 2600 expanded learning programs grant is that it has to be used outside of the normal school day. So it has to be used to supplement the school day, Saturday school, after school learning, before school learning, everything outside of the normal school day. This is a summary of the new funds continued art, music, PE supply grant there. You can see down 50% from the original allocation, but if we laid it out about 2.4 a year, same with the learning recovery. And then also Prop 28 to support VAPA classes, VAPA being visual and performing arts programs. So the state's really taking a hard look at art, music programs as it relates to education. That used to be the low-hanging fruit back in the day. When you needed to cut, that would be the first place they cut. And studies proved that was, it failed miserably. That wasn't the way to go. Okay, so the next slide just basically lays out what our next steps are. So we need to do a third interim budget report incorporating the adopted budget adjustments, and that'll happen at a school board. And it happens on May 11th, but it's recording the district's financial information through April 30th. So all the transactions that have occurred up through April 30th. May 25th, we preview the LCAP and the budget together, but remember they have to be reviewed and adopted at different meetings. They can't be adopted and previewed at the same meeting. Then June 15th, we'll review the proposed budget and LCAP at a school board meeting. And if all goes well, June 29th, we'll adopt the 23-24 budget and LCAP at a regularly scheduled school board meeting. And with that, I take any questions that you have.
And thank you, DeCarlos. Hi, everybody. I'm Jody Talkington, Senior Director of Strategic Projects for the SOUP office, and I am going to move us into breakout questions first. So don't worry, we are going to come back together as a whole group after breakout sessions to. All right, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully the breakout rooms were supportive in getting out your key learnings and questions. So I'm going to start now with taking a look at the note taker sheets and raising up some questions, primarily the fiscal questions for DeCarlos and Troy to help answer, and then we'll have an open Q&A as well. And lots of learnings. Thanks for sharing those as well. Okay, so one key question here is thinking about grant funding and how is that allocated? How is decided what comes from the general fund versus grants? How are those managed? How are they budgeted for site? So just a little bit more information about the use of grants and how they're used by site and central. If you can share kind of high level there.
Well, most grants are targeted, meaning they need to be used for a specific purpose. They're not open for interpretation like the unrestricted general fund. Some are competitive, right? You have to go after them. You have to submit a plan of use for the grant. And then the grantor, if you're approved, will provide what's considered deliverables a lot of times. And so in order for you to be reimbursed for these monies, you have to demonstrate that you use the grant in accordance with the MOU and you achieve the desired results of said grant. Grants are restricted, but they're different than, say, like other restricted funds like Title I. Title I is also restricted, but it's not a grant. It's ongoing. It's targeted, right? It's meant for English language learners, but it doesn't have the stringent requirements like some of the grants that, you have to do the work and then you have to submit an invoice and you have to submit supporting documentation in order to be reimbursed for that grant. The way they're derived is based on several different factors. A lot of it, especially as it relates to the supplemental grants, are relative to socially or economically disadvantaged children, or they'll be specific to a program, say arts like VAPA, only to be used for visual and performing arts. The measures that we spoke about, those will come with certain stipulations that were approved by the voters, like you can't use it to pay administrative salaries. A portion of it needs to be used for, retaining teachers and things of that nature.
Two things I wanted to add to the answer to that. One is for just context for people. Prior to the pandemic, our budget was probably closer to 1/4 restricted, 3/4 unrestricted, and we've gotten a lot more money, one-time money during the pandemic. And our state administration likes to do funds that are restricted and like categorical funds that are restricted as opposed to unrestricted funds for the district. And while that targets something, it does reduce our overall flexibility in terms of what we can do with our budget, because we have all these targeted funds we have to manage and make sure we're meeting whatever the deliverables are. And yet we sort of have back on the ranch where the base things that we have to do, we're sort of juggling to manage those. And the last thing I'll say, because it came up in our group, Oakland receives more donation or philanthropy per ADA or per student than certainly every district in Alameda, and among the highest rates in the state.
Okay. A little somewhat follow to this. Can you take this question about grant funding a little bit further and explain the difference between unrestricted versus restricted funds? And some follow-up questions on that are, like, do raises for teachers need to come from restricted or unrestricted, one of the two? Does the balanced budget need to occur in the restricted or unrestricted funds? What's our FTE? I'll repeat these if needed. What's our FTE breakdown in terms of, what's restricted, unrestricted? We heard that some positions were moved from the base to grant funding. So it kind of just sharing, like, where do grants fall in restricted? So a little bit more this grant conversation, but take it into the unrestricted, restricted world and explain that a little bit. I can repeat some of the questions if
So I'll just start with the first part, Jody. So unrestricted versus restricted. You typically won't have any grants that are unrestricted. We, as a result of the local control funding formula and the supplemental and concentration dollars, that almost made unrestricted dollars restricted. And it almost turned them, in a way, into grants, because the funds that are earned in the local control funding formula for supplemental and concentration must be spent on the kids that earned them. And so the kids that earn them again are what we consider our unduplicated pupil percentage, or UPP. So that's the unduplicated number of kids that you have that are English learner, foster youth, free and reduced, other factors, but you can only count each student one time. And so that data drives what your supplemental and concentration kids earn. Now, when LCFF was first introduced, we did the calculation for supplemental and concentration. However, if those funds weren't spent by the end of the year, they were just swept back into the general fund, and then they became unrestricted. As of a few years ago, there was legislation passed that said you can't do that anymore. And so if your supplemental and concentration dollars are earned based on the demographic of kids, and you don't use those funds that year, those funds go back into the pot, and they need to be redistributed next year to the same demographic of kids. So if it's less kids, then they'll get more per kid, but we can't just sweep it to the unrestricted general fund. Those are the only dollars in the unrestricted side of the house that are restricted. And I know that gets a little goofy. Restricted dollars can be used to pay for raises in the event that they're ongoing, say Title I, Title II, because these funds we've had forever and we're paying FTEs out of there. What happens, however, is if that particular grant is not written in a way or does not support the amount of increase, the general fund will have to cover the difference. For instance, if you say you do a competitive grant, and when you write that grant's for 5 years, and you build into that grant a COLA of 3 to 5% per year, then the grant will organically allow for you to increase your salaries over that time. But if you do something and say, just hypothetically speaking, you give a 20% raise, then the grant is only going to cover up to what they agreed upon when you did the MOU, which is 5%. That other 15% needs to be covered by your unrestricted general fund or your fund balance. Going back to what Director Davis said earlier from the trustee, you never want to use one-time expenditures to pay ongoing expenses. And so any sort of raise that goes on the salary schedule is ongoing. So even if you're paying those expenditures from a resource that lasts 5 years, okay, that resource can cover those expenditures for 5 years, but what happens on the 6th year? Those expenses are incurred on the unrestricted general fund, or you have to make adjustments. And then Jody, there was a second part of that. I'm sorry.
I think you kind of answered a few of them. It was kind of like the difference. Also, like you mentioned where raises could come from in those separations. FTE breakdown. And so like, where do our FTEs land? You mentioned they're in both. Maybe explaining when we went through the reductions that happened on March 9th, some FTE were moved into restricted funds. So kind of why does that help? Basically about like balancing our budget. What's the difference between restricted and unrestricted in that sense?
Good question. And so you're moving out of the unrestricted general fund into a restricted resource, but you're doing that as sort of a bridge. You're doing that to give yourself more time to adequately prepare, right? What happened to us this year happened so suddenly, but if we are able to think through this over the course of 12 months, then typically you can make better, more informed decisions. Also, if you put into context that, okay, so I have to steer away from this because this is getting a little more into negotiation, so I won't, I'll leave it there.
Can I just jump in though, DeCarlos, and just say, I think part of the reason we end up talking about this so much is that there's so much pressure on the unrestricted general purpose dollars, right? What they call 0000, right? Quad zero, because so many, all of the other funding sources have requirements on them or stipulations or how can you use this money? And so, in order to just pay teachers and a principal and office staff at a school site, the basic things that you need to have a school, like that needs to come out of unrestricted, and any increases for those folks need to come out of unrestricted. And so then there's so much pressure on like, how do we get more unrestricted dollars to be able to do those? And that's where we keep on trying to shift expenses to where we can to these other funding streams so that we can free up unrestricted dollars, because that's where all the pressure is.
And that's not unlike other districts. There's a general sort of budgeting theme where you are using your most restricted money first so that you can keep your most flexible money available to respond to reality, right? As it shifts and changes. And so you're trying to move things that can be in the spirit of whatever the restricted resource is, aligned with whatever the purpose and the restrictions are, to move things there to free up this unrestricted money. That's to cover everything. It has to cover every shortfall. It has to cover every new thing that comes up that doesn't have a designated resource for it. And so you'll often see, not just in Oakland, folks shifting resources to the place, shifting expenditures to the most restricted resource they can to free up the unrestricted.
Thank you. About 3 more questions from the note-taking sheet from small groups, and then we can open it up to new questions coming. And feel free to keep using the chat, as I see some of you doing. So another couple questions in the same sort of theme came up in one group about, let's see how. So basically, like having a reserve and this idea of like going into receivership or not having a balanced budget. So can you explain a little bit like what is required to have in the reserve, like the amount, the type of money? Because there was another question of like, can't we just go into debt? Sometimes we have to use our credit card and pay for things that we really need, and then we're going to pay it back, but we're in debt for a while. So kind of just explaining that in terms of a district budget.
Okay, you guys. All right. Okay, because this is okay, great question. However, this one gets a little tricky. We have what is known in public school finance as deficit spending. If you were to take a look at OUSD's second interim financials from this year, our unrestricted general fund side of the house shows that we're going to deficit spend to the tune of about 18 million, 17 and some change. However, our ending fund balance is, it was 97 million, almost 100 million. And so we are deficit spending in the current year 17 million, but our savings, right, our fund balance is enough to absorb that and still be relatively healthy. Also, we have what is known as the reserve for economic uncertainty. That is a state mandate that requires districts in excess of 30,000 average daily attendance are required to reserve 2% of their budgeted expenditures in the county schools, in the school district service fund. That's Fund 01. OUSD has a policy to reserve 1% above what the state's requirement is. And so ours is 3%. So we have that reservation. We also have earmarks for other liabilities that were either incurred before or are going to be incurred in future years, but we have to earmark them. And so in the, so in what we consider our profit and loss statement or the books for the current year, right? We're not looking at any year. We're only looking at this current fiscal year. You can realize a deficit, and sometimes it's a strategic deficit where we received funds this year and those funds were recorded in our revenue, but there were no expenditures against them. And so all that revenue falls to the bottom line or our ending fund balance, but we know we're going to spend those funds next year. And so since those funds were already captured in our balance, when we get ready to spend those funds next year, we don't realize the revenue on the books anymore. All we show is the expenditures, therefore creating a deficit in that particular year. However, remember those monies are in our savings. And so structurally it's a deficit, but it's not really a deficit because it's sort of captured in our fund balance. Now, that's fine. That's hunky dory. What happens is, and what makes you qualified is if your MYP shows financial distress in the out years, meaning, okay, if you look at our second interim this year, we're showing a deficit in this year, but not next year, right? Or the year out. However, if we were to show a deficit of 17 million this year, and then we show another 20 million next year, and then we show another 30 million yet the preceding year, and we get to a point where our ending fund balance becomes negative, right? Not our current year expenditures, but our savings, right? Our savings isn't enough to cover our deficit. That's what makes the people from the state perk up. And that's how you go into receivership. 1 year of deficit spending won't cause it. Multitude and deficit spending in the fund balance, not necessarily in your P&L or your profit and loss or your current year financials.
Okay. I think there were a couple follow-up questions. I think you kind of answered them. But as you were talking, some clarifying questions popped up. So one was about,
can I just speak to why that's bad, right? Because people are like, well, what's wrong with receivership? And so just to clarify that when the state came in 2003, there were, contracts got abrogated and, democratic process kind of went out the window, and it was just the state appointed superintendent basically made all decisions, and there was no consultation or anything. It was just what he said went. So, I think just for people to understand that we're in the tail end of receivership from 2003, so it doesn't feel as impactful anymore. But back then, 20 years, as Ms. Jensen is saying, was a dictatorship, and it created a lot of long-term problems. So it's really bad.
I want to add something to clarify something that people don't get, is that the resources that fund, most of the resources that fund education in school districts in California come from the state. It's the state's money. It's not Oakland's money. And so you have a local school board that then is entrusted to use that money for the benefit of the local school or local students. When you're in receivership, that part is gone. You have no board that makes decisions. The state, the provider of the money, comes in and decides how you're going to be able to spend that money to make sure that your budget's balanced. And when they come in, they do so because they had to give you a loan in most cases in order to stay afloat. And so they're making sure they pay off their loan. They're not focused on, at least not as much, the local needs of your community.
okay. I'm going to go to one more group of questions. Feel free to come back to that, because there were some questions of like, can you clarify again, deficit spending, and also are we talking about unrestricted or restricted when we're talking about the reserve? So there's some follow-up there, and you can take a look at the chat, but I want to get one more in before we open the whole group, because there were several questions in the chat and in the notes about special education funding. So in particular, around the vacant roles that were, so the action on March 9th, the one thing was a lot of the vacancies were, the reductions came from roles that were vacant, and some of those were in special education, particularly paras. So in terms of this particular, the impact and understanding that there's probably a lot of folks in the room who are related. We don't have our executive director of special education or our chief academic officer to talk specifically about impacts, but we will make note that that came up. But I want to see if you could answer about vacancies and what was the decision there, if you could explain like the reductions of vacancies. And then I think even Director Davis, I believe part of it was the board asking staff, and maybe I'm kind of answering here in the resolution, that there was a request of staff to provide a more detailed analysis of special education investments and resources so that the board could take a look at that as an impact. So that is coming to a future board presentation and potentially the teaching and learning committee. I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, but there definitely was an ask of the board to understand that a little bit more. So let me just open it up. If you want to speak to anything about vacancies, what happens when those are reduced, and then anything about special education, as much as this particular group can answer that, but definitely more to come outside of this space.
I can just say that, so just keeping track of the whole process of budget development, right? So there were some eliminations that happened at the meeting on March 9th, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to add back positions if we need to. So I think that's part of the assessment that's being done in special education over the next few months as part of budget development. So the issue that was being confronted was that there were a lot of vacancies in special education that were very hard to fill because they're not adequately paid, and so it's hard to recruit people to actually fill those positions. And so it just felt silly to have positions sitting there that weren't getting filled. And so those have been eliminated, but now through the assessment, as students are placed in different schools through the options process. So this is the first year where all special education students are able to participate in the options process for the first time fully. In previous years, they were placed through different, processes through special education, but now all families, including special education families, are able to participate in options. And so as students get placed, there might be a need for additional positions at certain sites, and those would, of course, be added in to fully meet the IEP. But so just because a position was eliminated doesn't mean it's gone forever. It's part of a rejuggling of positions that's happening through as students are being assigned to different campuses this year.
So now I'm going to open up. I see some questions in the chat, so I'll go to those, but you can keep putting in the chat or you can raise your hand. So now anything that was on the note taker sheet that I didn't summarize that you're like, oh, I really want to ask that still, you can raise your hand or put in the chat. And as you're thinking of those and getting ready to raise your hand, I'll read a few that came in. One, how long is the hiring freeze in place? Does anybody remembers or the time frame of the hiring freeze?
Probably Director Davis may have better sense of that.
I think there's different aspects to it. So I think there was one piece that was specifically to allow, the bumping process to happen so that we wouldn't be hiring people in at the same time that we're trying to figure out whether there's going to be any bumping. And then I think there was another piece of it that was related to TSAs and I think it's confidential employees. And I think that one might be just something that the board has to take action on, because I'm not sure that it was fully articulated in the resolution.
I shared the resolution in the chat earlier. I have it pulled up. It is at the discretion of the superintendent or designee. And it's a prohibition on the different classifications that we talked about earlier, but the whole resolution was linked earlier. I can link it again.
And there's also a question of are the percent that we need to have in the reserve? Do we still need a 3% reserve? Can the board vote to drop that to 1%? And then some information too about the connection of the 3% and the going below 30,000 ADA. So can you share what's required for our reserve and what number?
The board can opt to eliminate the additional 1%, but what's required by the state is required by the state.
And so that is if we go below 30,000 ADA, then we have to kick up to 3%.
Okay.
Well, we would, according to our resolution, we would have to kick up 1% higher because the resolution is 1% higher than the state requirement. But again, the board could vote to reduce it back down to the state requirement.
Okay. And then the process for budget, okay, will the process for budgeting prior to the March 15th cutoff be earlier next year? Some of those thought there was some behind the scenes going on. So maybe just sharing in general what the budget development process and the timeline throughout the year. We know March 15th happens every year. A little bit why these decisions were later. I think we shared that earlier. So what do we expect or what do we hope for next year in terms of the timing?
Yeah, I can take that one. So
Great.
I think there was definitely some quote unquote behind the scenes. I mean, I think what happened was because we have a relatively new board, I think there was a lot of back and forth between staff and individual board members, from what I understand, as to what was going to be the target for the budget reductions. And so the problem with that was that took a while, having a new board and getting people comfortable with the idea of what the target was going to be for budget reductions. And so then when the proposals actually became public, it felt very last minute to the community, and then the board wasn't ready to take action on that so quickly. So I do think that we need to have a longer runway next year. I think again, I don't know who'll be board president next year, but if we have, different board presidents and every year they're kind of coming into being board president right as this is starting, I think it's important for there to be a policy in place that, so it's not up to the individual board president, but it's actually a board policy saying that we'll see some proposal for budget reductions in January, so that we're not up against the deadline in February. We have some time for community engagement. So I do think that needs to be a new policy that's gives some direction to staff around that and to future board presidents. And so I think that's something that I will be trying to bring forward later this year. And I know we have the board president on the line, and we've definitely been talking about that as well. And he's expressed support for that idea as well.
I think I want to lift up a couple of tensions that exist for us. So the March 15th deadline is there if you're going to need to do layoff notices. Districts don't like doing NAIDOF notices. If you're a growing district that's growing in attendance, you don't often have significant layoff notices that you need to do. And so that timeline is less of an issue. As you're a declining enrollment district and you're shrinking for whatever reason, whether it's budget reductions that have large scale shrinking, or you're just shrinking because you have a reduction in students, now this becomes a larger issue. So that's at the back end. That's at the, we need to make a decision by such and such date. At the front end, the information that you get to make that decision, you need to know what your enrollment projections are in order to have an estimate of how much money you're projecting to get the following year. Then in January, the governor, usually the first or second week in January, the governor is proposing a budget. That's where that COLA percentage came from. And so you're sort of squeezed on the front end in terms of having adequate information to project how much money is coming in, and you're squeezed on the back end to the extent you're going to make significant changes to the number of staff that you have. And so some districts face that more than others, but there's certainly more time than we got this year. But it's usually this squeeze between January and March for districts who are in a declining or budget adjustment kind of scenario.
Okay, thank you. There's some question about back to the reserve again. One putting out that we think we're actually even higher. We're kind of maybe more like an 8% reserve, so potentially confirming that. And Sam, I see you jumping in here too. So I was sort of thinking about like what's best practice for districts in the reserve. I know we were at really close to our required minimum for several years when our current superintendent, Kaigler Johnson Chamel, came in, and it was like really encouraged at the board at that time to not just live at the cut line, but try to build up the reserve for things like COVID, like crisis that come up. And so maybe you can speak to that just from your, maybe Director Davis, since you put some in the chat, or Mr. Kaigler, just about what you know is best practice around that, because there's also some advocacy to, in these tough times, lower the amount that we're saving.
I was actually going to ask Troy, because didn't we get into, we kind of got really close to the edge. I think this is, in 17-18, but drawing on some of the other funds in order to make up the difference. Is that right?
Yeah, I'd be really curious, as Mr. Kaigler has a best practice for districts of our size. What I've seen is people sort of try not to, there was a cap, but even before the cap, when I talked to other business executives in school districts, they're not trying to go over 10%. They're sort of trying to stay in that range. But that's usually smaller districts. So I don't know if there's a best practice for districts that are of our size. We certainly were below the state requirement and had to quickly shift things around and had some things happen at the state budget that helped us get back above that requirement. But I'd be curious, Mr. Kaigler, if there's any sort of best practice for districts that are as large as Oakland.
Yeah, the thing about the larger the district, typically the less reserve you have, because there's so many different components that you have to fund. For Oakland, though, I will say, if you look at our second interim, our REU is, you'll hear it referred to as, that's your reserve for economic uncertainty. At 3% is about, I think it's currently 23 million, right? So if you think about that, 3% of our currently budgeted expenditures. However, 1 month of payroll for us is about 45 to 50 million. So if you put that into context, that reserve for us won't even cover 1 month's payroll. And so having a little more cushion to be able to prepare for rainy days does behoove us. For districts of our size, however, it's not super common. I think what you're going to see across the state is pretty much every district built their reserve through the pandemic, and it was a result of several things. You're not spending as much. Everybody's at home, but also we received a lot of one-time funds that we use to supplement other places that we would normally be experiencing liabilities, and those funds were allowed to sort of just grow over that time. Now with these one-time funds expiring, us going back to in-person learning and things coming back to normal, those expenditures are expected to come back. So one-time funds run out, expenditures go back to normal, you should see the reserve right size. I forgot which proposition it was, but it was started a few years ago where they wanted to place a reserve cap of 10%. That did get voter approved, although it hasn't been, they really haven't come down yet. We've been hearing that they're about to start coming down, but it is currently 10%.
And can you just clarify again, with the reserve, we're talking about unrestricted funds only, correct?
Yes and no. So
Other than supplemental
restricted-
concentration.
yeah, well, because restricted funds, although they make up your combined ending fund balance, they're considered legally restrictive. They're in an object 9740, not to get all nerdy, but everyone knows that money's off limits. The money that you're really looking for is everything on the unrestricted side. And even now, we have our 3% reserve, but we also have an amount that is unallocated, undesignated, if you look at our second interim. And so I think someone put that in the chat about 8%. That's where that 8% number is derived from. It's that 3% and then whatever falls to that bottom line of unallocated.
Okay. There's some another question about historical. So Troy, I don't know if this is you, but thinking about, are there other examples of when we had to pull from the reserves? You said you went under, or just examples of when Oakland was really close to the reserves, and then why that's so risky, again, with example of the payroll.
Yeah, I don't have an example of when we had to pull from the reserve. The example I was giving is when we went under the state mandated 2%. And so when you go under the state mandated 2%, it's a mandate. So you have to fill that savings account back up. And we did fill that savings account back up. So I'd have to go back and look and see if there are other times when we actually tapped into it. The state obviously wants you to have reserves so that if something happens, you can cover it before they have to come in and cover it. And that's the reason to have some kind of baseline. But in terms of what it's been spent on, I have to go back and look.
And this is where I think in 2000, I mean, so the time that Troy's talking about, I think was 17, 18, and it was pulled from the self-insurance fund. And so then the self-insurance fund got dangerously close to being empty. And then going further back in 2003, that was where the district didn't have enough money and tried to borrow from the facilities fund. And the state came in and said, no, you can't do that. That's not allowed. And that's when the state came in and put us in receivership.
All right, so we have about 7 minutes left. Maybe time for one more question before we close with any next steps and just appreciations? Is there any other one more burning question anybody wants to put in the chat or raise their hand?
I think everybody's ready for spring break, Jody.
Yeah, I think so. Okay.
Well, I just really want to thank everyone, especially Mr. Kaigler, Mr. Christmas, Ms. Talkington, for pulling this together. I know it was a little bit like I said, everyone's kind of so busy right now with trying to figure out exactly what the impact was of the adjustments. And so I know all of these folks had a lot of other things on their plate, but we did feel the need to come back to the community and respond to some of the questions that were still lingering. And we'll probably end up doing this again in a couple months. I'm not sure. I think I'll do a different topic next month because it would be nice to not only talk about the budget, but really appreciate everybody. And also thank you to everyone who was a facilitator or a note taker in the small groups, because that was a lot of people just volunteering their time. And it really helps to understand where people's questions are. It helps us to just get better about getting information out to the community. So really grateful to everyone for doing this and for taking the time. And please spread the word, share what you learned tonight with other people. This is a teach one kind of situation. So please spread the resources. There's a lot of good information in the chat, and I will be posting the slide deck and the recording on social media so people can also find it there. So thank you all. And if there's nothing else, wish you all happy Cesar Chavez Day on Friday and a good spring break.